So welcome back to Face2Face. And in fact, today is Faces to Faces. I'm going to introduce you, then I'm going to step out of the way and let the experts get on with it. So Cathy Mohlahlana, very well-known broadcaster on radio and TV and a multi-award winner. And the eternally youthful Dr. Somadoda Fikeni, one of our favorite political analysts. And not always controversial, but always thought-provoking. Or maybe that is controversial in itself. And I thought it would be nice to let two famous faces talk to each other. And let me get out of the way so that they can do what they do best. You can get the benefit of just sitting, watching. And remember, if you're interested in booking them, then you can come back to us. But I think you're going to enjoy the content of what follows. So Cathy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Stu, and for raising the bar so high. Not too much pressure, I hope, but it's always a pleasure being in conversation with Dr. Fikeni. He, of course, is one of the voices that we've come to trust in this country to help us make sense of the developments that we are seeing. And I suppose it's about making sense of our world, yes, but what you said, Stuart, is also important. In many ways, we need to rethink and reimagine the kind of country that we're living in and what we would like it to be for ourselves in future, but also what we would like future generations to inherit from us. And all of that comes from the decisions that we're able to make right now in this moment. And Dr. Fikeni, I think, you know, COVID-19 has in many ways brought different things to us. And, you know, people talk about how it has exposed the fault lines, basically, where there were things going wrong. It has not only revealed that, but in many ways, it has also exacerbated the state that South Africa is in. I just want to begin with your own reflections of what you think going through this global pandemic has done for us as a country.
Well, I do think that, as you correctly say, again, thank you again, Cathy, for this nice introduction, and Stuart as well, for the preface to our discussion. The first thing I would like to say is that COVID-19 pandemic has simply amplified all our weaknesses. It has put them under a magnifying glass for everyone to see. It was right from the time we had the first lockdown when you realize that inequality in the country, law enforcement, and many other institutional weaknesses were the greatest challenge that we face. And it was now there for everyone to see. When government promised to intervene, and many people were quite positive by giving in some kind of a boost to small businesses which were struggling, as well as some money to people who were unemployed or struggling, it became very clear that the institutional capacity to implement decisions was greatly challenged. And that is one thing we've always said in this country. We have the best intentions, we have one of the best constitutions, we have one of the best audit, arrangement or governance systems. And yet we find ourselves on the wrong side, precisely because what is written on paper and what is implemented simply do not match because of our institutional capacity or lack of it thereof to implement. So that was one first thing that was exposed. Then when there was to be procurement of the personal protective equipment, that's when it became very clear that the cancer of corruption, especially by those who are politically connected, and the nexus between the entrepreneurs and the politicians has become the kind of thing which is at a level of treason or economic sabotage, because it didn't actually matter that the country was near bankruptcy. The country had to borrow money in order to even fill in the gaps. And this we had seen with Nelson Mandela funeral, with Winnie Madikizela Mandela funeral, with Mlangeni funeral, that even funerals are no longer sacred spaces. They have become industries of people who loot public resources. So those two things exposed our law enforcement weaknesses, especially in dealing with organized crime. And that in itself is going to be one of the greatest tests for our president and the government at the moment, because it is undergoing a serious reputational crisis.
I want to talk about the institutional capacity that you've referenced, right? Because in many ways, we've had different types of indications that some departments don't function as well as others. Some ministers perhaps also don't function as well as others. But I found that when one watches how things have been playing themselves out, on some level, it seems that the incapacity goes even beyond that, that it's different layers of people that are supposed to be functioning in a particular way that is simply not happening.
Certainly what has happened has evolved over the years. The first one, when you have recruitment of people because of their political connections, instead of recruiting people because of their competence and professional acumen, the political class seem to have developed a patronage system where the networks of clients and patrons seem to have captured the state in the main. And of course, at times working with the business sector outside, because you'll always have this insidious relationship between business and politics. And when that happened, institutions were collapsed. Competent, capable people who were resisting any corruption were removed. And then we were left with individuals. There is a time in this country when I didn't care to know who was the CEO of state-owned companies, whether it's SAA or SABC or ESCOM, so forth, because it didn't matter. There were systems. You went there, you read the policy, you followed those. Then over time, you were told you need networks to get your things done. That's when it tells that institutions had been weakened or destroyed, so that individuals become the barons within the institutions who distribute resources, who can override even the governance systems within. So that is the situation that we face. And of course, over time, even the political deployees in their political positions of executive, it became a matter of who is loyal to which faction rather than who is capable. And some of them had not worked in any other capacity. And all they knew was to be career politicians. And that to them is life and death. And rising to leadership position within these, with these sectors and factions meant that you had to adopt some of rough methods, sometimes gangster-like methods where you have to cheat the system. You have to, do everything to trick everybody. So not the best came out to become chairpersons of branches, to become chairpersons of provinces, or chairpersons or even presidents of unions and so forth. Over time, this is what has happened. It has weakened leadership institution. It has weakened institutional capacity as well.
It's interesting because it brings up this idea of politics almost being a sector of its own.
In fact, it's not even a sector of its own. It has become a sector that has overcome and overpowered other sectors. Of course, you still have pockets, especially of your big businesses, which are insulated by their sheer size and their autonomy, ability to operate in and outside the country. If, for example, you look at Nespas could still survive because they are planted all over, the world. So they can resist. In fact, they can even buy the political class to have the influence. And that brings me to the other issue of lobby groups. You saw during COVID that whilst many other sectors matter, agriculture and many others, the ones which were most vocal, the ones which were always in the agenda became the tobacco industry as well as alcohol, because those ones are regulated and they are more likely going to be lobbying the political class as well. So there is a need to examine and to look at the relationship between those regulated industries and the political class, because the kind of lobby, the kind of pressure that you saw does such that there's something happening there, whether it's legal tobacco or alcohol or illicit one. Those networks, if we are to deal with organized crime, if we are to deal with undue influence on the political class, they need some examination and possibly some regulations and policies.
So do you think then that the lobby groups that we saw emerge, and even the positions that were taken by political parties when it came to whether or not the lifting of bans should be effected, do you think that that tells us a lot about the kind of relationships they may or may not have with some of those that were affected, especially some of the industries that were affected?
Certainly, without any doubt, Cathy, you could see the political undertones. Others were fearful that when you close the legal cigarette or tobacco industry, then you are going to have the illicit one flourishing. And remember that there had been stories before to say the illicit trade of cigarettes were funding some of political formations. So you do have this mutual suspicion, whether it's a fact or not, but the political undertone suggests that. Then at a legal level, you may have the lobby groups which simply fund political parties because they know they are regulated. Throughout the world, by the way, those regulated industries tend to set up camps in the capitals of, political formations in order to lobby them. That's why you find that they will fund research in universities, they'll fund political formations and lobby groups. And that's why sometimes we come across ridiculous things to say cigarette is as dangerous as milk, because they fund those kinds of research.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm keen to know that when you then look at where we are today, I mean, we've moved on to lockdown level 2. What are you expecting to change when it comes to the behavior of these lobby groups? Because many of them still have outstanding cases in court. Do you think that the posture is going to remain the same? And if it does, to what end do you think that might be?
Actually, what has happened during the COVID-19, because out of every crisis, there is always an opportunity. That's why there is a say that never let any crisis go to waste. What we've seen here is the galvanized nation and the outrage over corruption, which is going to come from below at the grassroots level, even beyond just your usual NGOs and interest groups which normally take up these issues. The people on the ground now realize when corruption is rampant, it impacts on the job creation. It collapses the economy. And at times, it collapses your ESCOMs, it collapses your PRASA, your every other thing, which then inconveniences the public itself and the citizenry. And also they've seen VAT being increased and other tariffs being raised, which means those who steal, the public will pay because government is nearly bankrupt. And that in itself, to me, I think is a very positive thing that is beginning to happen. And I'm sure this rising tide is going to lead to a set of policy reforms. And also it is going to lead to a punishment of any political formation or leadership that doesn't seem to take seriously the outrage on the ground. It may also lead to us devising new laws to deal with the issue of party funding on top of the disclosure that we are talking about.
One of the things that we saw earlier on this week was the Human Sciences Research Council releasing the findings of its popularity rating of the president, if you can put it that way. And they found that while he went into it at the beginning of lockdown, his ratings were above 80, you know, and now that we are at lockdown level 2, those numbers have gone down quite drastically. I think it's sitting just at above 61%. Should the president be worried about a figure like that? And what does it mean, actually?
He should be worried for a number of reasons, because initially COVID-19 had given him an opportunity unparalleled in his past few years in the helm of our state to showcase what he can do. And he was coming in as a father figure. He was convincing. And that in itself raised his profile and even credibility. But when the lockdown issues started complicating with the easing of restrictions and different pressures coming across, and even worse when corruption came, and some of it coming very close by association to his office, that in itself, I think, dented his image in a big way. And it doesn't help that in the midst of that, you would have had people accused of VBS involvement, VBS bank involvement, being redeployed again under his watch. And now you do have Zandile Kumede of eThekwini, who is still facing charges, being redeployed. That in itself makes him look weak, makes him look, lacking decisiveness. And it makes him look like he is, at the hands of factions which are battling it out. So he will have to make something special, something drastic. His incremental approach, yes, is appreciated, but it's taking too long for an impatient society.
Of course, one of the other challenges that arises from this dynamic is the fact that from the outside looking in, there doesn't seem to be a central power where decisions are being made. Things just seem to be all over the place. There seems to be a lack of coherence, even on some of the issues that are supposed to have been decided on, whether by the ANC and subsequently translating themselves into how government functions, especially where we're talking about corruption.
There was a time when we could talk about the ANC in a singular. And nowadays, since it was fragmented, we speak of the ANC in a plural. And each time there's a statement from the ANC, you wonder which ANC, because it is factionalized. And sometimes it has drawn so much focus and energy into itself that if the leaders are navel gazing, they are not looking at the bigger picture. They are not looking at the vision of the nation. They are more concerned and consumed about the checkmate of which faction is doing what, who is doing what, and so forth. And that in itself is what has weakened the president, has weakened the ANC itself. The center can no longer hold. Hence, you do have each province, each region doing its own thing. And hence, the bar has been so lowered to the level of saying, even when a person is obviously involved in the wrongdoing, that brings the party into disrepute. They normally say, we're waiting for the legal, master, which is the court cases, which take forever. So the center no longer holding. That is the main problem.
Of course, when you talk about there being different sides to the ANC, many people say that that is a way of excusing. It's a way of excusing the party, because all of the leaders that are part of the ANC, and in fact may find themselves mired in controversy, they report to one body, and therefore this idea that there's a good and a bad ANC is a false narrative, because President Ramaphosa was supposed to be the bringer of this new dawn. And the new dawn today is the front page of the New York Times with COVID-19 corruption.
In fact, for me, I never subscribe to the notion of the good versus evil in politics. Rather, referring to the multiple-headed ANC, where you do find that the wrongness sometimes cancel each other. And that's why Batablet Dlamine's statement was apt in this particular case when she said, each of us has smaller nyana skeleton. And it simply meant there is a balance of embarrassment and a balance of fear. Each side saying, if you reveal this, we will reveal this. That's why you do not have this good versus evil. What I do in a more pragmatic sense on my side is, even when politicians do have their weaknesses or factions do have their weaknesses, to the extent that those weaknesses do not cloud their judgment and eclipse the good work they ought to be doing. But the moment such weaknesses start paralyzing everything they are doing, then it becomes a matter of concern. Most political leaders sometimes do have their weaknesses, but they hide their weaknesses because they are effective, they have a vision. You see something happening, they are decisive, they take action. In this particular case, different factions are simply involved in the internal ANC battles at times, and they are canceling each other out, and there's none of the two which can come out and say, I'm clean.
Where does that leave President Cyril Ramaphosa, especially with this analogy that you've just given to us of the exposing of one's weaknesses and the efficiency of a leader then coming to the fore in times like this, and in having to deal with all of these different things that are presenting themselves, the different interests and the different motives that are at play?
Well, it leaves him weak if he's trying to balance the two factions and trying to please all of them and leave them happy. He's likely to achieve one singular thing of making both factions very unhappy, those who supported him and those who are his political opponents, if he's not taking decisive actions. A leader must never try to please everybody and try to work so hard to be loved. Just do what you can and be respected for the vision and the coherence of what you want to do. And that is what he ought to be doing. But if he failed to do that, and he's trying to balance everything out, and sometimes he works out and try to say ANC unity without principle, because that is very important, is far most important than national interest. That's where we are now. We are at a forked road where we could say a choice has to be made between prioritizing national interest or prioritizing ANC factional balance of forces.
Many South Africans are incredibly frustrated with the state of affairs today. The state of the economy is making that frustration even worse because people are feeling it in their pockets, they're feeling it in their livelihoods. How do we begin to reimagine a different South Africa to what we have now? And how much of that as citizens should we see as lying solely in the hands of the political parties that are in government, on the day?
To me, what sometimes encourages me never to wallow in the valley of despair is looking at historical events across the world. When societies and countries have gone through a deep crisis, like was the case with Great Depression in the US, it brought the best out of the US because leadership came forward, like Franklin D. Roosevelt came with a new deal. The infrastructure that was put in place, the public works programs, the change that took place was triggered by the crisis of Great Depression. Again, if you look at Japan, Germany, they were ruined, they were reduced to the ground by the World War. That in itself gave them a chance to reset their button, to do things differently. Rwanda, when we were going for our elections, they were actually plunged into a genocidal civil war. Look at where they are today. So sometimes, as a patient, you must not have a mild headache because you never visit a doctor. You must have a migraine headache. Then that's when you attend to your problems. Now we know our problems. They are so amplified that no one can avoid looking at them. In fact, some of decisions such as closing or merging SA Express had taken years when you knew that this was a failing project. It took this crisis where Treasury said there's no money to say the shop is now closed. So sometimes crises of this nature may be painful, but they create a unique opportunity. Again, the issue of inequality, the issue of not formalizing the taxi industry, the issue of non-inclusive economy is coming to a sharp focus, not because of anything. People rationally now can see the consequences of that it's not just a sectoral problem, it's a societal problem that we ought to address. So to me, I think a number of positive things, if we manage this transition and the rebuilding of economy, may come out in a very positive sense, but it should not be left to political parties alone, because we're drifted to what I call a partocracy, where life in our political space resided in political parties, but civil society, NGOs, social movements should come to the fore.
It talks about then a resolution, much of which will need the ordinary people of this country standing up and saying that they've reached the breaking point. And I'm just looking at the examples that you've given, and one of the things I'm asking myself is, have we as a country in fact reached that breaking point? We know that things are very, very hard right now, but is this going to be the straw that breaks the back, basically?
Without any doubt, remember that we have not even understood the implications and the results of COVID-19 pandemic. When those come out, you might even find ourselves close to the fiscal cliff, wherein even the monies for social grant may not be readily available, wherein funding for ESCOM and many other things, already people are suffering from the blackouts or the load shedding. And each one of us now is affected in some form. No one says it's happening in some province, it's happening in some corner. So the kind of pain and the inconvenience that we're beginning to feel is likely to galvanize us into action. Remember that in South Africa, whenever masses got involved, society changed. It was the mass defiance campaigns of the 50s that produced the Freedom Charter. It was the mass marches of the early 60s that produced the tragic moment of Sharpeville, but again ushered in a new era of liberation struggle. It was the Black consciousness movement of the 70s getting into the communities that shifted so many things. It was the mass democratic movement of the 80s that things started changing. The moment we demobilized the society, the civil society, the NGOs, with a few left, the moment even the world community started defunding some of those effective NGOs and voices which were there, that's when only political parties became the only game in town. Now we have to rethink that strategy to say, to have checks and balances, you need a strong social movement, strong NGOs, strong civil society, and a conscientized society which understand that there's nothing called government money. It's our money as taxpayers. Instead, we've given it to government as a trustee to disperse it on our behalf on common good. And that in itself is the consciousness that we must begin to have when government fails, because it has failed to carry out that task. Then we are the ones as shareholders who have to fund the government going forward.
Dr. Fikeni, I'm going to wrap up with this question. Do you see all of this taking place without the use of violence? Because we also seem to be in a perfect storm, that the social and the economic conditions that the majority of people in this country find themselves in are the conditions that lead to unrest.
Society that we have as South Africa, we're a noisy, argumentative, and temperamental democracy. And as such, we already have experienced low-intensity violence in a form of protest, some of which are violent, whether it's the labor movement instigated protest or the student protest and so forth. So we already are in that particular space. That's why protests, road closures, road blockages are as frequent at times as weather report, as well as traffic report in this country. If things get worse, you may not discount instances where certain pockets become even more violent. But at the same time, what is hopeful and a promising thing, our judiciary and respect for law when the outcomes have come, and the faith among political parties on the multi-party democratic system, that they've accepted the outcomes when they lose in the metros, they lose the provinces and so forth. That's a hopeful sign that people still have some faith in our constitution, some faith in our institutions.
Dr. Somadoda Fikeni, let me thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a great catch up, and I think so much that you've said that will certainly leave me thinking and pondering on about the state of our nation. Stuart?
Thank you both so much. I love getting you two together because we get to hear about stuff that keeps us awake at night. And a lot of it is justifiable. It doesn't make us feel any better, but I think, Dr. Fikeni, you give us great insights to what your colleagues and associates and friends are telling you, and we don't always get that. And Cathy, thank you for getting it out of him so comfortably and effortlessly. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Pleasure, Stuart.